Hello, welcome to a very special conversation. Gulzar's work has seeped into the cultural consciousness of several generations. His words have helped us express our innermost thoughts across the spectrum of human emotions and concerns. The myriad confusions, sublime joy, fathomless grief, idealized romantic love, the playfulness of life, and a moral compass for it, the details that add up to our unique and yet universal experience, he continues to address all of them in his work. He has a new book out, a passion project that started about 8 years ago. It's called A Poem a Day, where he has handpicked or selected poems by nearly 300 contemporary poets and translated them into Hindustani, which is a combination of Hindi and Urdu for all of us. Gulzar Saab, it is wonderful to see you. Thank you very much for this new gift to the work, to the world of art and culture. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you, and very nice to see you and talk to those whom I can't see.
How are you doing? This is such a incredibly unique year in terms of human experience for all of us. How are you as we head towards the end of what is going to be a year that goes down in world history as a year which changed the course of life for many people?
This year has been, for the entire world, it has been a very different kind of a year, and a different kind of I think, get together also.
Yes.
Without meeting each other. I mean, the whole world seems to be in communication with each other, as it has never been before.
You know, when I look at this book, beautiful, red, hardbound, gold embossed, heavy book with 365 poems, I feel it's in a way almost sort of, yes, it's almost like you saying, thumbing your nose at this digital world that has caged us in the last few years, where everything is through a screen. Our reality has gone into digital screens, and here we are. You offer us a book. Is there a sense of mischief, or even in that?
No, not exactly, because while we used to write to each other on paper, we write on digitally now on the screen, and that's what we have been. And this is an experience for myself, talking to you like this. Otherwise, you would have called me to the studio, isn't it?
Or come to your study if you had invited us, whichever. Yes, that's true. This is all very new and different, isn't it?
I would have visited your studio, and I would have been there sitting with you, having a cup of tea and discussing poems. And here we are sitting at our own places apart, and yet it's a new experience for me altogether. Altogether a new experience. And about this book, as we were talking about, and this has been an effort of last 9 years for me. There was a notion in my mind. You don't mind अगर मैं बीच में हिंदी में बोल दूं?
बिल्कुल, बिल्कुल.
I'm very comfortable with that. अंग्रेजी आपकी जितनी नहीं आती मुझे.
और मुझे हिंदी तो बंगाली हिंदी है तो वो लोग हंसते हैं. काकी का बहुत प्रॉब्लम हो जाता है.
আপনি যদি বাংলায় কথা বলতে চান তা আমি বাংলায় বলতে পারি. नहीं, सिर्फ ये कि ये हमेशा this used to bother me कि in schools and colleges what the students are when they take up the poetry book, the selections of masters and old masters and the great high poetry, they don't relate to your times. They don't relate to what is happening around in the world. I mean, in their times. Everything is in past.
Yes.
So I had a desire to reach the contemporary poetry to the younger generation. They must know the poetry is a relevant subject. The poetry is a live subject.
Yes.
Poetry is live, and it relates to all to the world which they see around them. This was an important factor. So from there, I took up this work of the poetry which I heard and the poetry which I read, and from where I became a poet.
Hmm.
I put a line of 1947, the independent India, to present the present um, poetry to the youngsters of the India which they know.
Hmm.
So that was the effort, and that is where I should say that it was not possible to work this much and publish a book like this, but HarperCollins came to my help there, and that is where Mr. Anand Padmanabhan and Udayan,
Hmm. Your
uh,
editor.
he's the editor.
Hmm.
They helped me to publish this work finally.
Hmm.
I started collecting that to see the face of India, I must know what is happening in the other languages of India.
Hmm.
I mean, it couldn't be possible that only Hindi or only Urdu or only English or only one language would be able to present the total face of Indian poetry. One had to relate to other languages, what is happening in Malayalam, what is happening in Tamil, or what's happening in Bangla.
Well, Gulzar Saab, what I find interesting is how you decided to translate these different languages, the poems that you selected in these different languages, into what you call Hindustani.
Yeah.
Why did you not feel that you wanted to leave it at English and not use English as a link language? Because I know you've thought of that deeply.
The English as the linked language was already there.
Yes.
One could pick up poems from different languages in English, and one didn't have to work much then. But
Hmm.
then, for the languages which are not there published or which have not been translated into English.
Hmm.
For example, Kokobo, that's one of the languages of Northeast, or say Adi, that's another language of the Northeast. And it would be hard and difficult to find out those tribal languages. The poetry has been coming even from tribal languages,
Yes.
and
Yes.
which was not available in English. And secondly, Hindustani was a purpose because in Hindustani, culturally, we are bound with each other. All the languages are bound with each other. Culturally, they are linked with each other. For example, I should say, if I say Pangat or if I say Mangal Sutra, in English you will have to give the detail what is it. But in our own languages, we would understand what it is.
What it
If I,
signifies. Yes.
say कि अर्जुन का तीर जाके लगा चिड़िया की आंख में, तो इंग्लिश में आप ट्रांसलेट तो कर लेंगे, but then you have to know the source of Arjun, which you have to explain in Indian language. They all know whose Arjun we are talking about.
Given that this was the goal, this was the goal to capture India in the voice of its poets and contemporary poets, what were some of the filters you used? Because this is a mammoth Herculean task, isn't it? So what were the filters you used to zero in on the poets, on the languages, and then finally the poems that would make it to this book?
I had to, of course, naturally do a lot of research work for this. And the goal was, first of all, myself. I wanted to educate my own self what is happening what is the face of Indian poetry. Just to know what is the face of total Indian poetry. And I found it very interesting. And it became interesting learning also for me, not only for others. It was even for myself. It was a very, very good a trip to educate myself once again with
Hmm.
what's happening in poetry of contemporary India. So then that attracted me, and then naturally you want to share it with others. 6, 7, 8 languages one can understand, one can be close, but not with all the languages.
Yes.
So that's where I had to work hard and approach if the poet is alive, approach the poet, sit with them. Hindustani can communicate in those areas, those languages. Whereas English may not reach there.
Yeah. In fact, it's interesting you mentioned that you approached some of the poets, if they are alive and they had done perhaps their own English translations of the original language. When you approached them, did you make it a point to go back to each poet with the translation wherever possible? And and if they had feedback, how did you react to it?
No, I could not reach to each one of them.
Hmm.
Some of them I could reach, some of them I could connect and communicate with them. Some I had to reach to people who knew that language. If not somebody from that language,
Yes.
you could explain it to me. For example, I should say for all the South Indian languages, Mr. K. Sachidanandan, he helped a lot. Mr. A.J. Thomas,
Thomas, yeah.
Academy, he's the editor of Indian literature. He provided me with the uh, languages uh, from the Sahitya Academy, because they had the publications. Mr. Thomas helped a lot in that. And then he could also guide me to the people who knew that language or those who were expert in that language.
Were there any reactions from some of the poets who you read out what you had written, or you sent them a copy of your translation in Hindustani? Did you have any interesting reactions from anybody?
No, first of all, I had to get it approved by the author that this is what they are trying to say, and get it translated in English.
Right.
Because there are both the languages in this. Now,
Yes.
English is one linked language which is already prevalent. Literate world, literate India, and Hindustani, which is not even literate, but they know the language. Somewhere that is where Hindi films have helped a lot. Because of Hindi films, that kind of Hindustani reaches everywhere.
Yes, that's true.
You don't have to tell them what is roti. Roti ya dal bana do. So in English, you may have to struggle to explain to them.
Yes.
But dal, they would understand what it is.
So the power of the Hindi films and Hindi cinema. Do you think, Gulzar Saab, that as someone who is a poet and then a lyricist, that being able to communicate or use your ability to write poetry and sort of adapt it to songs and the music of Hindi cinema, do you think that's a great good fortune for a poet? Because, you know, thanks to your book, there are so many poets that I have encountered as a result of your book for the first time. And I hate saying this because it conveys my ignorance, but that is the truth and reality. So do you think that to get to be a lyricist of film songs, whether it's Hindi or any other language, is actually quite good fortune for a poet?
Well, that's true that it is finally this language, the language which I used in this and which I called Hindustani, because that's the language which we use in cinema also, to have an all India approach. That's the part of learning which I had during films. And Hindustani, naturally, even I think in 48, Gandhiji also had said that stop calling it a Hindi or Urdu, stop calling it Hindustani, because it's going to finally pick up that dialect, pick up Raja, I should say, that diction. Even today, common man speaks Hindustani. He doesn't speak a pure Hindi or a pure Urdu. Secondly, you don't speak the same Urdu everywhere. You don't speak the same Hindi everywhere, not even English. You don't speak the same English everywhere. You know Bangla. You don't speak the same Bengali everywhere. It changes with the area or with the region wherever you are. So that is the capability of calling it Hindustani, because it will pick up a few phrases or few expressions or words from the area which you have gone to. That is the beauty of Hindustani. That is what makes it vast.
Talk to us a little bit about your discovery of poetry. It began in school. it was something that you considered as a profession or as a vocation that you wanted to adopt. Is that correct? And that early on, for someone to say, I want to be a poet, you don't hear that very often or regularly, isn't it?
So that we'll speak some other time when I have to speak of how I grew up and how I picked up languages and how I was brought up. Punjabi is my mother tongue. Bulle Shah and Waris Shah I'm at home with them because that is in my mother tongue. But then I had contact with other languages, even in school and even in college later on. And learned Urdu from always.
What would you say you see the role of the poet and the writer, especially when we go through some of the poets you have included here, you know, the great Marathi poet Kusumagraj. You begin with Haldar Nag, who's a Padma Shri, who's writing in Kosi. You've written a poem inspired by his poem called Letter to Haldar. You know, there is Sitanshu Yashash Chandra, Gujarati poet you have in your book. I mean, these are just a few of the names of the 279 poets you've got in this book. When you look at some of the work that you've used, what would you say people see the role of a poet as being? What do you, Gulzar Saab, see the role of the poet in contemporary times and time immemorial?
Today's poet, what the poet in any of these Indian languages who's writing, is relevant to the people. Is relevant because they can understand, it can become their voice. If it's a protest, a poet writes about that protest. If it's hunger, poet writes about the hunger of today, or struggle of a laborer, or the struggle of a kisan, of the farmer. If you go back to the syllabus of the school and college textbooks, you will not find these connections. That is what was inspiring and what is that I feel should be done. And poets do keep their times and their society relevant in their poetry. That's what is required, and that is what is happening. But it has not been reaching people. That's one of the purpose of doing this book, so that you know that this poetry or the poetry done today is a living poetry. It is relating to their everyday life. For example, I have translated Kusumagraj, a full book of Kusumagraj. And being in Maharashtra, where and especially in Bombay, you hear at least 4 to 5 languages every day. They cross they come fall in.
Yes.
You listen to at least 4 to 5 languages, 2, 3 languages, almost every Hindustani speaks. Every Indian speaks 2 to 3 languages. And that is what is relevant, and that's what I think should go ahead with it.
You have very many female women poets, poetesses in this book. Do you see a change in the way women have expressed themselves over time when it comes to self-expression?
Well, women have been writing very dynamic poetry. I should say, Mamang, for example, writing in Adi, Northeast. He writes a very dramatic poetry. Women are at par with that. I mean, they are at par with everybody in the society. They don't have to be mentioned as women.
Yes, yes.
For example, if you have read her poetry, I think one of the most dynamic poets we had. And she wrote in Malayalam as well as she wrote in English.
I want to bring movies into the picture because a lot of people are familiar with your work as a songwriter and of course as a filmmaker. We were just talking about women poets, and here we are in the movies where women have been, their expression and their feelings and voice has been articulated by men for a very, very long time. Do you think sometimes that the very romanticized nature or expression when it comes to love in the woman's voice uh, that maybe if women were writing it themselves, it might have been a little different?
Not exactly, but certain perspectives, I should say, men could write about. So, for example, yeah, Amrita Pritam, which she wrote, the way she wrote. I mean, there are certain subjects which was typically of women's subject, and I would speak for example, my daughter. If I mention Meghna for this, she wrote poetry in the beginning, and then she made films also. But a subject which came out from her own poems is like Filhal. I don't think a man would have thought of that subject like that.
Yes. The story of surrogacy and of friendship, yes.
I think that's what is very important. They have their own perspectives also. It is like for certain subjects, even man would have his own perspective. That apart, but I won't divide them as men poets and women poets. I call them all poets and writers, and wonderful writers, and wonderful, if you say wonderfully women have participated in the growth of our literature. And I've included many of them in this.
Yes. Gulzar Saab, you made a film in 1977 called Kinara. I bring it up because perhaps in one of rare occasions you see a Hindi film actor playing the role of a poet, and there's this beautiful song that Dharminder sings, Ek hi khwab kai baar dekha hai maine, as to explain the difference between writing poetry and ordinary day conversation. When you look back in that context of the poet, do you feel poets get their due in society?
Yes, why not? They have all along. You won't have a Rabindranath Tagore otherwise. You won't have a Jayanta Mahapatra today.
Yes.
I mean, these poets are, I mean, you got a Nobel Prize for a poet. Then, I mean, what are the other ways of recognizing it or their role in society?
And yet you don't have young children say we want to grow up and be a poet. That, I think that's what I was trying to get at, sir.
I'm saying, yes, there is much more outside films also happening. Poetry is not the entire whole poetry is not happening in films only.
Of course, yes, yes.
That's why I'm saying in all these languages, you don't have to come to films to approach or to reach you, the common man.
Gulzar Saab, what are you working on? This book is now out with all of us. We can all access it. What have you moved on to working? Because I believe that you're at your desk in your study every day, crafting and working on something.
This book, and then I'll give you another one.
And then you'll give us another one. Okay, that's lovely to hear. Thank you very much for this conversation. I wish you a lot of good luck, and a lot of good luck to this book and to all poets who have enriched our lives with their expression over the years.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anuradha.
Thank you, Gulzar Saab.